The dust kicked up from the wagon wheels as Sarah clutched her worn carpet bag, staring at the sprawling ranch that would now be her home. The sign hanging crooked on the gate read Double Creek Ranch, and beyond it stretched endless acres of Montana prairie under a sky so vast it made her feel smaller than she already did. 3 months ago, she'd been answering an advertisement in the Boston Herald for a mail-order bride. Now, at 22, she was hundreds of miles from everything familiar, married to a man she'd only corresponded with through carefully written letters. The townspeople in Cedar Falls had made their opinions clear during the brief ceremony at the courthouse that morning. She'd heard the whispers as she walked down the aisle in her simple blue dress, the only decent one she owned. Bargain bride, they'd called her, their voices carrying just loud enough for her to catch the words. Poor Thomas, having to settle for what he could afford after Martha died. Thomas McKinnon sat beside her on the wagon bench, his weathered hands steady on the reins. He was nothing like she'd imagined from his letters. Taller, certainly, with sun-carved lines around his blue eyes and a quietness that seemed to run deeper than mere shyness. He'd been kind during their brief courtship through correspondence, but now that she was here, really here, an awkward silence had settled between them like morning fog. "The house isn't much," Thomas said, his first words in nearly an hour. His voice carried the slight drawl she'd noticed at the ceremony, different from the crisp Boston accents she was used to. "But it's sturdy. Built it myself after I bought the land from old Henderson." Sarah nodded, unsure what response he expected. The house came into view around a bend in the dirt road, a modest 2-story structure with a wraparound porch and flower boxes beneath the windows. What surprised her was how well maintained it looked, how the evening light caught the fresh white paint and made the whole place seem to glow with warmth. "It's lovely," she said, and meant it. She'd grown up in a cramped tenement with 4 younger siblings, sharing a bedroom with her sisters and wearing hand-me-downs until the fabric fell apart. This house, this land, it was more space than she'd ever dreamed of having. Thomas glanced at her, something unreadable flickering across his features. "Martha always wanted flower boxes," he said quietly. "I finally got around to building them last spring." Martha, his first wife, who died in childbirth along with their baby 2 years ago. Sarah had learned about her from his letters, but hearing her name spoken aloud made the woman feel suddenly real, present in a way that made Sarah's chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. That first evening, Thomas showed her through the house with the careful politeness of a stranger. The downstairs held a kitchen larger than her entire family's previous home, with a cast-iron stove and cupboards painted a cheerful yellow. There was a sitting room with a stone fireplace and 2 comfortable chairs positioned near the hearth. Upstairs, he paused at the end of the hallway. "That's the main bedroom," he said, nodding toward a closed door. "I've been sleeping in the spare room since, well, for a while now. You can have the main room, if you'd like. Or the spare room. Whatever makes you comfortable." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. They were married now, legally bound, but clearly Thomas had no expectations beyond the practical arrangement they'd agreed to in their letters. She was here to keep house, to help with the ranch work, to be a companion. Nothing more had been promised, and nothing more was being asked. "The spare room will be fine," she said. "For now." The next weeks fell into a rhythm as predictable as sunrise. Sarah rose before dawn to prepare breakfast, learning to cook on the wood stove and manage the temperamental oven. Thomas ate quietly, thanked her for the meal, and headed out to tend the cattle or mend fences. She spent her days cleaning the house, tending the vegetable garden Martha had started, and trying to make sense of her new life. The townspeople's whispers followed her to the general store, to church on Sundays, to the few social gatherings she was reluctantly invited to attend. Bargain bride, they'd murmur when they thought she couldn't hear. Mail order wife. Poor thing probably came from nothing. They weren't entirely wrong, but their pity stung worse than their judgment. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife and unofficial social arbiter of Cedar Falls, made her position particularly clear one Sunday after church. "You know, dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "Thomas is such a good man. After losing dear Martha, well, we all understand why he had to make practical choices. I'm sure you're very economical." Sarah had smiled and nodded, but that night she'd sat on the porch steps and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to cry. When Thomas found her there, she quickly wiped her eyes. "Everything all right?" he asked, settling beside her on the steps. It was the closest they'd sat since her arrival. "Just tired," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Mrs. Henderson has opinions about most things. Most of them aren't worth much." Sarah glanced at him, surprised by the gentle humor in his voice. "She thinks you made a bargain purchase." "And what do you think?" The question caught her off guard. In all their careful politeness, they'd avoided discussing the true nature of their arrangement. "I think," she said slowly, "that we both got what we agreed to." Thomas picked up a small stone from the porch step and rolled it between his fingers. "What if what we agreed to isn't enough anymore?" Before Sarah could ask what he meant, he stood and went inside, leaving her alone with her racing heart and a dozen questions she didn't dare ask. The change began small. Thomas started lingering over breakfast, asking about her plans for the day. He brought her wildflowers from the meadow when he came in for lunch, claiming he'd pick them for the kitchen table. When a summer storm knocked out several fence posts, he asked for her help holding the wire while he hammered, and their hands brushed as they worked together under the wide Montana sky. Sarah found herself looking forward to these moments, these small intimacies that felt like they might be building toward something larger. But she was afraid to hope too much. She was practical above all else, had learned to be from growing up poor. She was here because Thomas needed a wife and she needed security. Anything beyond that was dangerous territory. The truth of what the townspeople thought became clear when Sarah overheard a conversation at the general store. She'd been in the back aisle, selecting fabric for new curtains, when she heard familiar voices near the front counter. "That McKinnon girl is plain as morning rain," one woman was saying. "Poor Thomas, having to settle for whatever he could afford to bring out here." "Well, what did you expect?" another replied. "A man of his means, living way out there, needing someone to cook and clean. He couldn't attract a real wife, not after Martha. This one probably cost him nothing more than a train ticket." Sarah's hand stilled on the bolt of blue cotton. She knew she should leave, should spare herself the pain of hearing more, but she found herself frozen in place. "I heard she came from some slum back east," the first woman continued. "Probably jumped at the chance to escape. Can't blame her, I suppose, but it's hardly a love match." "At least she seems to work hard," the second woman conceded. "House looks better than it has since Martha died. Though I suppose that's what you get when you buy practical instead of pretty." Sarah finally forced herself to move, leaving the fabric and walking quickly toward the door. But as she passed the counter, she heard one final comment that stopped her cold. "Thomas deserves better, after everything he's been through. That girl's nothing but a bargain bride, and everyone knows it." "Actually," came a familiar voice from the doorway, "that girl is my wife, and she's worth everything I have." Sarah turned to see Thomas standing in the entrance, his hat in his hands and his blue eyes blazing with something she'd never seen there before. The two women at the counter had gone pale, their mouths opening and closing like landed fish. "Thomas," one of them stammered, "we didn't mean a—" "I think you meant exactly what you said," Thomas replied, his voice level but carrying an edge that made both women step back. "But since you seem confused about the situation, let me clarify. I didn't settle for anything. Sarah came here because I asked her to, because I wanted her to. And if you think that makes her worth less, then you don't understand the first thing about what makes a person valuable." He looked past them to where Sarah stood frozen near the door. "Ready to go home?" he asked, his voice gentling. Sarah nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Thomas paid for his purchases and they walked to the wagon in silence. It wasn't until they were well outside of town that either of them spoke. "You didn't have to do that," Sarah said finally. "Yes, I did." Thomas kept his eyes on the road ahead. "I should have done it weeks ago. Should have made it clear from the start that anyone who disrespects my wife disrespects me." "Your wife," Sarah repeated, testing the words. In all their careful politeness, he rarely used that term. "That's what you are," Thomas said. "And that's what you've been since the day you said yes in that courthouse. I know our arrangement started as something practical, but Sarah—" He pulled the wagon to a stop and turned to face her fully. "Somewhere along the way, it stopped being just practical for me. I don't know when it happened, exactly. Maybe it was watching you sing while you hung laundry. Maybe it was the way you've turned that house back into a home. Maybe it was just time, and proximity, and the fact that you're nothing like what those people think you are." Sarah's heart was beating so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What am I like, then?" "Strong," he said without hesitation. "Brave enough to travel halfway across the country to marry a stranger. Kind enough to tend Martha's flower boxes like they were your own. Smart enough to figure out the ranch books in half the time it takes me. And beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with what those small-minded people in town think beauty should look like. Thomas. I know this wasn't what you signed up for," he continued. "I know you came here for security, for a better life than what you had back east. But I'm hoping that maybe, if I'm lucky, you might want something more now. Because I do. I want a real marriage, Sarah. I want to share that main bedroom with you, and I want to build a life that's ours, not just mine with you helping out around the edges." Sarah looked at this man she'd married, really looked at him, and saw things she'd been afraid to notice before. The way his eyes crinkled when she made him laugh. The careful way he handled anything fragile, including her feelings. The strength in his hands and the gentleness in his voice when he spoke her name. Those women were right about one thing, she said, and saw him tense. I did jump at the chance to escape. But not because I was desperate for any husband. Because something in your letters made me think you might be worth the risk. And now? Sarah reached across the space between them and took his work-roughened hand in hers. Now I know they were wrong about everything else. I'm not a bargain bride, Thomas. I'm the woman who chose to build something new with a man who sees her worth. And if you're willing to be patient while I figure out how to be your real wife instead of just your housekeeper, then yes. I want something more too. Thomas brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, a gesture so tender it made her eyes burn with unshed tears. I've got all the time in the world, he said. We'll figure it out together. As they drove home under the endless Montana sky, Sarah understood that what she'd found here was worth far more than the security she'd come seeking. She'd found a partner, a home, and a love that had grown slowly and surely from the rich soil of mutual respect and genuine affection. Let the townspeople call her a bargain bride if they wanted to. She knew the truth now, and so did Thomas. She wasn't a bargain at all. She was exactly what both of them had been looking for, even when they hadn't known what that was.